Sarah adjusted the delicate lace sleeve of her wedding gown, her hands trembling slightly as the morning sunlight spilled across the cabin window. The dress had been a compromise between her dream and practicality, ivory satin that clung to her soft frame in ways that made her both nervous and proud. She had spent months preparing for this day, convincing herself that it was the right decision. Love had always been difficult to find, especially in a society where her body was often treated as something to be mocked or criticized. But today was supposed to be different, a new beginning. The arrangement had been unusual, even by small-town standards. A friend of a friend had connected her with a local man, someone seeking companionship, stability, and marriage. It wasn't love at first sight when they met through video calls, but he had seemed kind, polite, and willing to embrace the idea of building something steady. Sarah, tired of years of failed dates, cruel rejections, and loneliness, had agreed. The plan was simple. She would travel to his cabin in the Colorado mountains, where a modest ceremony awaited. Guests were few, just family and close friends. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was hope. Snow had started falling as the car climbed the narrow mountain road, adding a quiet beauty to the scene. The white flakes swirled against the dark pines, dusting the rocky slopes and creating a postcard-worthy view. Sarah leaned back in her seat, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The driver glanced at her through the mirror, offering a sympathetic smile. She must have looked terrified, sitting there in full bridal attire, bouquet in her lap, lips pressed together in nervous determination. The directions had been given clearly, or so she thought. She had no idea a simple mistake would change her entire life. When the car stopped, Sarah blinked in confusion. The cabin before her didn't match the pictures she had seen. Instead of a modest, decorated space ready for vows and guests, there was a massive log lodge standing tall and silent, its windows glowing faintly with the light of a roaring fire. Snow had gathered on the wide porch, and the scent of pine smoke lingered in the air. She hesitated, clutching her bouquet tighter. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she asked the driver. He nodded with certainty, pointing at the address on his sheet. "This is what I was given." Heart pounding, Sarah stepped out, the cold air nipping at her exposed skin. The train of her gown swept against the wooden steps as she climbed onto the porch. She felt out of place, overdressed, vulnerable, like some misplaced doll in the wilderness. She raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the heavy door swung open. Filling the frame was a man unlike any she had ever seen, broad, towering, with shoulders like boulders and a beard that framed his rugged face. His piercing blue eyes locked onto her instantly, his brows furrowing in shock. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence pressed down like the snow falling outside. "You're not supposed to be here," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who lived close to the earth. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stammered, unsure whether to explain or retreat. She managed a nervous laugh, lifting her bouquet slightly as if it were proof of her purpose. "I think there's been a mistake," she murmured. The man studied her, his expression unreadable. He stepped aside, his massive frame making the doorway look small. "Come in before you freeze," he said simply, his tone not unkind but firm. Grateful for the warmth, Sarah obeyed, though her heart thudded wildly with uncertainty. Inside, the lodge was a world apart from the cold outside. The fire crackled in a stone hearth that stretched nearly to the ceiling, throwing golden light across the wooden beams. Antlers, old photographs, and handcrafted furniture decorated the space, telling the story of a life built in solitude. The air smelled of cedar and smoke, masculine and earthy. Sarah stood awkwardly, the absurdity of her situation settling in. Here she was, dressed as a bride, bouquet in hand, in the living room of a stranger who looked like he had stepped out of a lumberjack legend. She wanted to explain, but words felt tangled in her throat. The man crossed his arms, leaning against the wall, watching her with a mix of curiosity and restraint. "You're lost," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. She nodded quickly. "I was supposed to be at a wedding. My wedding." The words sounded surreal even to her. His brows lifted slightly. "And they sent you up here instead." His deep voice softened, though still laced with disbelief. Sarah felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. Apparently, she admitted, she could already imagine the chaos happening at the real location. Guests waiting, family whispering, her intended groom wondering where she was. The thought made her stomach twist. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Sarah glanced around, her nerves buzzing. This man's presence was overwhelming, not just in size but in the way he seemed, so rooted, so unshakable. She felt small, fragile, even foolish in her lace gown. Yet something in his eyes unsettled her. They weren't mocking, not the way she had grown used to in strangers' stares. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity, maybe even a spark of admiration. She shifted on her feet, suddenly aware of how her curves filled the dress, how exposed she was under his gaze. It wasn't cruel. It was intent. She cleared her throat, clutching her bouquet like a shield. "I'm sorry for barging in. I'll call someone and figure this out." She reached into her small clutch for her phone, but of course, there was no service this high in the mountains. The man chuckled, the sound deep and rumbling. "No signal up here," he said, almost amused. "If you need to call someone, you'll have to wait until the storm lets up. Roads aren't safe right now anyway." Sarah froze, realizing the snowfall outside had thickened. Her plan to simply leave was unraveling quickly. She was stuck, stranded in her wedding gown in a stranger's lodge. Her heart pounded as she considered her options. Panic nipped at her edges, but the warmth of the fire steadied her. She looked at him again, this mountain giant who had appeared in her life at the exact wrong, or perhaps right, moment. She had no idea who he really was, only that his presence felt both dangerous and oddly safe. He stepped closer, not menacing, but deliberate. His towering form cast a shadow over her, and his voice dropped lower, softer, carrying an unexpected gentleness. "You don't need to be afraid. Sit, warm yourself. Whatever mix-up brought you here, maybe it was meant to." Sarah sank into the chair near the fire, the heat wrapping around her cold fingers. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to process what had just happened. She was supposed to be in the arms of a man chosen for her, a practical match. Instead, she was here, with a stranger whose presence stirred something in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She stared into the flames, wondering if fate had truly made a mistake, or if it had finally placed her exactly where she needed to be. Outside, the snow fell harder, sealing her in. Inside, her story had only just begun. The fire popped and hissed in the stone hearth, sending sparks upward as Sarah sat curled in the heavy leather chair. Her gown shimmered softly under the glow, though now the hem was damp from the snow. She tried to still her trembling hands, resting the bouquet on the side table. Across the room, the mountain man moved with quiet confidence, pulling a kettle from the stove and pouring steaming water into 2 mugs. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he had no concern for the strange turn the evening had taken. He brought a mug to her, his eyes meeting hers. "Herbal tea," he said simply. His voice was gravelly, yet calm, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep in her chest. She took the mug carefully, brushing his large, calloused fingers by accident. The contact jolted her, warm, startling, far too intimate for strangers. She whispered a thank you, staring into the cup. He lowered himself into the armchair opposite, his frame dwarfing the furniture. His gaze didn't waver, steady and unnerving, as though he were trying to read every thought she had. Sarah shifted, unsure if she should explain more or if silence was safer. Finally, she found her voice. "My wedding was supposed to be today," she said quietly, each word tasting bitter. "I don't even know how this happened. Everyone is waiting for me down the mountain. My groom, the guests, and I'm here instead." Her throat tightened as she spoke. The confession sounded foolish, even to her own ears. The man's expression remained still, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable, sympathy perhaps, or curiosity. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe you weren't meant to go there," he murmured. "Maybe you were meant to end up here." Sarah blinked at him, startled. She shook her head, clutching her gown. "That's ridiculous. It was a mistake. Just a mistake." Yet the certainty in his voice unsettled her, made something deep in her stir. She looked into the fire, trying to ignore how heavy his presence felt, how safe the warmth of this lodge was compared to the uncertainty awaiting her below. She wondered briefly if her groom even cared that she hadn't arrived yet. They had agreed to marry out of practicality, not passion. Her heart, she realized with a pang, had not been truly invested. Perhaps that was why she hadn't fought harder to get there. The man's voice broke her thoughts. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked up, meeting those piercing eyes again. "Sarah," she answered softly. His lips curved slightly, almost into a smile. "I'm Caleb," he replied. The name suited him. Strong, grounded, unshakable. Sarah rolled it on her tongue silently, feeling how natural it sounded. Caleb leaned back, watching her as though measuring the weight of her soul. The firelight danced across his rugged face, carving shadows along his jawline. He looked like the kind of man carved from stone, a creature of the mountains, yet there was gentleness in his eyes that belied his size. Time seemed to stretch as the storm outside howled. Snow thickened against the windows, cocooning them in isolation. Sarah's phone remained useless, a dead connection to the world below. For the first time in hours, she relaxed slightly, sipping the tea. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was steady, calming, like the rhythm of the fire. Caleb finally spoke again, his voice lower now. "You don't seem happy about this marriage you were rushing to." Sarah froze, startled by his observation. She considered lying, pretending everything was fine, but she couldn't under his gaze. "I'm not sure it was love," she admitted. Her confession hung between them, fragile and real. Caleb didn't mock her, didn't press further. Instead, he nodded as though he understood more than she had said. "Love isn't built on convenience," he said simply. His words struck her harder than she expected. She thought of the man waiting at the other cabin, kind, polite, but a stranger in so many ways. She had chosen him because she was tired of searching, tired of being dismissed because of her size. But had she ever felt seen, cherished? Her throat tightened. Caleb's gaze softened as though he could read the truth in her silence. The hours passed quietly, filled with small exchanges. Caleb told her about his life in the mountains, how he had left the noise of cities years ago to build his own world. He worked with his hands. Wood, stone, tools, living simply but fully. He rarely left the lodge except for supplies. Sarah listened, captivated. His voice carried a quiet conviction, a sense of belonging she had never known. When he spoke of the forest, of storms and stars, it was as though the mountains themselves had shaped his soul. For the first time in years, she felt her heart leaning towards something unexpected. Sarah shared pieces of herself too, haltingly at first. She spoke of her love for painting, a passion she rarely indulged. She admitted how the world had made her feel unworthy, how her body was always judged before her spirit. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on her, seeing her in ways no one had before. "You're beautiful," he said suddenly, his tone steady, certain. Sarah's breath caught. No man had ever spoken the word to her without hesitation or pity. It wasn't a compliment wrapped in obligation. It was truth. Her cheeks burned, her heart thundering. The storm outside grew fiercer, sealing the night. The fire burned low, casting shadows that made the room feel intimate, almost sacred. Sarah felt time bending, as though the universe had slowed to force her to notice this moment. Caleb rose to add another log to the flames, his broad shoulders catching the light. When he returned, he didn't sit across from her this time. He came closer, kneeling in front of her chair. His size dwarfed her, yet his movements were careful, tender. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You were sent to the wrong address, Sarah, but maybe to the right man." Her heart raced, her breath uneven. The intensity in his eyes pulled her in, as though he could see every wound she carried, every hope she had buried. She wanted to protest, to say this was madness, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears stung her eyes. Unbidden, Caleb's hand brushed hers, calloused but gentle, grounding her in reality. "Will you marry me?" He whispered, the question so raw, so vulnerable. It broke something open inside her. He wasn't asking as a stranger claiming fate. He was asking as a man who saw her wholly, without judgment. Her soul trembled at the weight of it. Sarah's lips parted, but no words came at first. She searched his face, desperate to find a hint of mockery, of insincerity, but there was none. His eyes burned with truth, his voice carried only hope. She felt the walls around her heart crack, years of rejection and loneliness crumbling under the force of one simple question. Her body shook, not from fear, but from the terrifying possibility of happiness. Slowly, she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. Caleb's breath released in a soft exhale, his forehead lowering against hers. The fire glowed around them, sealing the vow. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to their choice. The world below was still waiting, perhaps still searching for the missing bride. But in this lodge, in this impossible twist of fate, Sarah found what she hadn't even known she needed. She hadn't been sent to the wrong address at all. She had been delivered to the man who would change her life. As Caleb's arms wrapped around her, strong and safe, Sarah felt for the first time that she was exactly where she was meant to be, and the mountains, silent and eternal, bore witness to a love newly born.